Do you know what's crazy? We built rockets that catapulted people to the moon, left footprints in the lunar dust. And then, as if it was just an expensive party trick, we just put the tools away and settled for Earth's orbit for decades. The first space race, which began with Sputnik's beeping signal in October 1957, was a rush of innovation and competition. The Soviets sent Laika, the first dog, into space, then Yuri Gagarin as the first human, and Valentina Tereshkova as the first woman into orbit. The Americans responded with Alan Shepard, who was up there for just 15 minutes, but that wasn't enough. President Kennedy drew the line with his famous speech. By the end of the decade, we will land on the moon. And they did it with Apollo 11 in July 1969, when Neil Armstrong's small step became a giant achievement for humanity. Under my videos, many people ask me the completely legitimate question of why we managed to do that in the 60s and 70s, but can't do it anymore today. That raises legitimate doubts about whether we were ever on the moon at all. The answer to that is surprisingly simple, but also complex at the same time. My name is Sirwan, and this is Mars Chronicles. Shall we take off? We need to take a closer look here. This triumph depended on thousands of engineers, a total of 400,000 people who worked for NASA and over 20,000 companies. Here are some examples of these companies. North American Aviation, who built the command module and are now part of Boeing, Grumman for the lunar module and now Northrop Grumman, Douglas Aircraft for the Saturn V stages, also now Boeing. Rocketdyne for the powerful F1 engines, which are now part of Aerojet Rocketdyne, and IBM for the computers that controlled everything. These companies were the muscle behind Apollo, pumping billions into expendable systems that sank into the ocean or burned up after each flight. That's not an accusation, it's a fact. With the technology available at the time, it was already a miracle that they managed to accomplish what they did. The United States government commissioned NASA, which in turn held these companies accountable and also paid them handsomely. Because it was a colossal, expensive task with no guaranteed success and no long-term business model on the horizon. In the Communist Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, this was somewhat easier to implement because everything was centrally controlled and the economy and people had to follow orders from above. In the United States of America, it was a bit different. To create incentives for companies to participate in this program, which from a business perspective was pure madness, they relied on so-called cost-plus contracts. This is important, so pay attention. These contracts define objectives but without a real cost structure. NASA guaranteed the contractors that it would cover the costs and pay an additional percentage as profit. That means these companies had no incentive to work efficiently, let alone cost effectively. On the contrary, the more inefficient and expensive they were, the higher their profit was. That sounds like a bad joke, a conspiracy theory, or something a YouTuber came up with, but it's well documented. And these contracts still exist today, so the companies did what they always do when they smell a lot of money. They put on their blinders and started raking in the money. We'll see in a moment why that's extremely short-sighted behavior. Next one. The Saturn V cost over $1.5 billion adjusted for inflation, and that was for a program that consumed up to 4% of the US budget. There were protests even back then. People asked, why not spend the money on poverty, education, or infrastructure? Back then, that was a completely legitimate question. Because apart from the people who benefited directly and indirectly from the program economically, there were no noticeable effects for the average citizen. That was a purely political and military prestige program. The people at the time were not aware that today, 50 years later, we would be enjoying the innovations of that era. Or they simply didn't care. By the way, that's different today. Many of the rocket launches serve to build or maintain infrastructure for the average person. I'm thinking, for example, of GPS, weather or climate satellites, and the Internet of Things. If you want news like this and more space updates in your inbox, sign up for the free Mars Chronicle newsletter at Mars Chronicle Space. The link is in the description below. As soon as the race was won, the momentum faded. The Soviets had lost, the Cold War shifted its focus, and suddenly the costs had to be justified. Additionally, the Vietnam War was very expensive. Congress cut budgets and space exploration faded into the background. But here's the catch. These companies that had profited from the Apollo program smelled money in defense. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Grumman and Company, the core of the military-industrial complex. They shifted to satellites for espionage, communication, missile defense and nuclear deterrence. Here too, the aforementioned cost-plus contracts were used, with the difference that it was easier for politicians to justify the exorbitant costs. Space travel became a niche for national security, where governments could pour in billions without taxpayers complaining too much. Consider the Space Shuttle today. As an affordable transporter, it ended up costing over $77,000 per kilogram of payload into orbit, adjusted to $20-25. That was a step back from the Saturn V level of under $13,000 per kilo. Why? Because the systems were single-use, complex and maintenance-intensive, optimized for contracts with the Pentagon and telecom giants like AT&T or Verizon who could afford it. There, money played or still plays a minor role. From the perspective back then, the companies did the obvious and went after the money. I claim that if they had started back then to make their systems more efficient and to ensure that the cost-benefit ratio in space travel improved for the taxpayer, could they have also seen much more growth in this sector over the following 5 decades? Instead of just a handful of missions for the military and telecom giants, they could have built a broad customer base from all cities, sectors of the economy, science, and politics. Imagine how different it could be. If these companies had focused on reusability early on instead of expensive custom missions, the sector would have exploded. Instead, they shot themselves in the foot. The market remained small, innovation stagnated, and costs increased. The tens of thousands of companies consolidated their structures and cemented their positions. That means the big ones bought the small ones, which led to the market for defense, aerospace, and space being dominated by a handful of companies. These are each specialized, have de facto monopolies, and are able to raise prices at will. Oops, the F-35 program now costs twice as much and is 10 years late. Instead of having to pay penalties, this means record profits for Lockheed Martin. Oopsie, a Delta IV heavy launch costs $1 billion plus an annual base fee of $1 billion. Oopsie doopsie. A single space launch system rocket launch now costs over $4 billion, roughly 1% of Austria's gross domestic product. Only the military and large corporations could participate, while civilian dreams like moon bases or Mars missions were put on hold. Governments only justified spending in terms of security, and so the sector reached a plateau. So, stagnation. Mars, rovers, the ISS small deep space probes, all great things, but nothing world-changing. The price per kilo stayed high, planning took years, and failures like Challenger or Columbia made it even riskier. But now the tide is turning, and we owe that to the pioneer SpaceX. They have shown that these exorbitant prices are not necessary and that there is another way. Meanwhile, some competitors like Blue Origin and Rocket Lab are hot on their heels, but the next contender is easily 5 to 10 years behind. With the Falcon 9, they've pushed the cost down to under $4,000 per kilo. In 2015, the world was amazed when a rocket landed by itself, a moment that changed everything, something that the established giants had dismissed as impossible, uneconomical, or even dangerous. Today, in October 2025, SpaceX has landed the Falcon 9 rocket 515 times. It makes up 90% of the total payload weight sent into space. Who claims it's more economical, sustainable, or reasonable to let a $100 million booster crash into the ocean after its first and only use, instead of trying to bring it back? Is either fooling us or is a fool himself? Starship, the monster that can lift 100 tons and aims for 200, has already launched several times and partially landed. And it is an integral part of the Artemis program. It is supposed to bring crews to the south pole of the moon, where water ice is stored. That's no coincidence. Full reusability makes it affordable. No conceivable. Suddenly, we're not just racing to the moon again, but also to Mars and the other planets. For the first time, with a long-term sustainable plan. But SpaceX is not alone. Blue Origin, with New Glenn, which is currently preparing its second mission to send NASA satellites to Mars, is joining in. Their rocket is like a Falcon 9 on steroids. Stoke Space recently raised $510 million to push their fully reusable Nova rocket. That puts nearly $1 billion in their pocket. A game changer for daily launches under $1 million. Rocket Lab is planning Neutron's maiden flight before the end of the year, optimized for medium-class payloads, and they've already secured spots in the United States Space Force National Security Space Launch Program together with Stoke. These new space companies are flooding the market, lowering prices, and making spaceflight accessible. And the old giants hate how they're being shown up. By the way, the same thing is currently happening in the defense sector. So it's only a matter of time before they have to come up with something or disappear into obscurity. But that's not the topic today. Of course, there are hurdles, regulations, or geopolitical tensions. China is building moon bases. India is pumping budget into Indian Space Research Organization. And yes, the military aspect remains. Starlink has shown in conflicts like Ukraine how control of space means control of the battlefield. But that's exactly what drives us forward. The challenges make space travel exciting, and with affordable, reusable systems, the sector will grow, create jobs, and bring innovation. We are no longer trapped. The future is within reach, interplanetary, and for more than just the elites. If you enjoyed this analysis of the moon race and the new boom, subscribe to Mars Chronicles and leave a thumbs up. A huge thank you goes out to all channel members and Patreon supporters. If you also want early access to our videos, you can find all the information about it below in the video description. My name is Sirwan, and this was Mars Chronicles. Thanks for tuning in. Pera spera ad astra.